afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Wendy Cromash. I manage and moderate the Levy Lecture Series, generously produced by the Levy Senior Center Foundation, where I am also on the board. The Levy Senior Center Foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit whose mission is to support and enhance the Levy Senior Center here from Evanston. It's the only facility in town specifically dedicated for those 55 plus. This is the foundation featured on our super cozy, large and extra large, long sleeve 100% cotton t-shirts, which are $15 each. Contact me if you want one. Soon after the center was closed in March because of COVID-19, the foundation began implementing plans to expand the Levy Lecture Series from one lecture a month to one lecture each week. Going virtual and using Zoom was an adjustment for all of us. We made our mistakes and learned together, but it allowed us to expand our reach and bring these amazing speakers to hundreds of people who would have missed out otherwise. Please keep the Levy Senior Center Foundation in your mind as you allocate your personal charitable gifts this year. There is another reason we were able to expand our lecture series to once a week, and that is because of our corporate sponsor, the lovely people who manage Avidor Evanston, apartment homes for those 55 plus. Their building opened in June. It's in the center of downtown Evanston, and it's convenient to everything. Amazing amenities, gorgeous rooftop deck and pool, spacious layouts with tasteful design elements. Apartments start at $18.85 a month. Call 847-512-4232. Before we start today, I want to share some guidelines. All of you watching and listening today are muted. If you have a question or a comment, please use the Q&A icon on the bottom of your screen. I will read questions aloud throughout the webinar as appropriate. Please don't use the hand icon because I am unable to respond to it. Parts of our discussion today may be difficult for some listeners to hear. It might trigger painful memories. It may include describing the harm done to Emmett Till before he was murdered. We will do our best to let you know in advance. I will be interviewing our gifted speaker, author, and teacher, Chris Benson. Any points I make or opinions I share are mine alone. They do not in any way reflect or represent the Levy Senior Center Foundation. The music you heard before we began was Billie Holiday singing her interpretation of the song Strange Fruit, written for her by Abel Meeropol, and one of the songs on the album Billie Holiday and her orchestra, Diva. I will try to include the lyrics in the edited version of this webinar that will be posted on YouTube. Now let me tell you about Chris Benson. He is an associate professor at the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University. He's the co-author with Mamie Till-Mobley of Death of Innocence, the story of the hate crime that changed America, the account of the historical significance of the 1955 lynching of Till-Mobley's son, Emmett Till. The book was the recipient of the 2003 Robert F. Kennedy Book Award for Special Recognition. As a professional journalist, Benson has worked as a Washington editor for Ebony magazine, as a City Hall reporter in Chicago for WBMX-FM, as a contributor for the Chicago Reporter. As an attorney, he served as vice president and associate counsel for Johnson Publishing Company, the parent company of Ebony. This Friday, August 28th, 2020, marks the 65th anniversary of Emmett Till's murder. I'd like to start our discussion by introducing you to another important voice, Mamie Till-Mobley. Let me read a short paragraph from the introduction of the book, written primarily in the first person. The book is Mamie's story and Emmett's story. as well as a heroic account of how a naive, sheltered woman who had the worst possible thing happen to her, the death of her only child, and how she grew a spine of steel to confront the people and the system who killed him and tell the world about what happened. This is from the book. It has taken all these years of quiet reflection to recognize the true meaning of my experience and Emmett's. It took quite a while for me to accept how his murder connected to so many things that make us what we are today. A messenger, an active church member. God told me, I took away one child, but I will give you thousands. He has. And I have been grateful for that blessing. You see, my story is more than the story of a lynching. It is the story of how I was in my soul to pull hope from despair, joy from anguish, forgiveness from anger, love from hate. And with that, I turn it over to Chris.
Thank you. I hope I'm coming through okay. We're all struggling with the new technology. So thank you for having me. My special appreciation, obviously, to the Levy Center Foundation and, of course, to Wendy Cromash for having the vision to include this topic at what I consider to be a critical juncture in our national discourse. And we see that all around. It's not just the anniversary week of Emmett's lynching, but it's a moment to consider how we got to this place where we find ourselves and some direction for the future. So it's quite appropriate that we heard the words of Mamie Till-Mobley setting out at least a little bit of the journey that she had taken to record her story and to leave it behind. She was in terrible health when I met her, and we worked together on what turned out to be the last 6 months of her life to make sure that her story would outlive her. And in fact, it was published 9 months after she died. So I'm going to talk a little bit about not just the core story, what it means, and what we should take away from the experience of understanding not just the facts of the Emmett Till story, but the context, the true meaning of it, and how that resonates in this contemporary moment where we hear the name Emmett Till invoked far too many times in connection with the deaths, the murders, if you will, of young Black men at the hands of authority figures who ultimately get away with it. So as I've discussed with Wendy, we had an approach in putting this book together that it would become something of a trinity of intersecting stories. So you have the heart of it as the engaging story of a mother and son, and just a wonderful, loving story of this person who is transformed from an icon. We've heard about Emmett Till, but do we really know who Emmett Till is? In this story, we come to humanize him. And in the course of doing that, deconstruct the dehumanizing narrative that's at the core of any lynching. The body of it is, of course, the core story of the lynching and its significance in the civil rights movement, and the civil rights movement as significant in the development of the history of this country in the latter part of the 20th century. And finally, the soul of it is the journey, the spiritual journey of Mamie Till-Mobley, and you got a glimpse of that in the passage that Wendy read to you. She was a deeply religious woman who came out of a deeply religious family experience. It says something about the soul of Black America in finding some meaning out of the horrible tragedies that so many people have suffered. But also she was able to find some peace in the end. As I say, the last 6 months of her life, she found some peace in being able to tell the story and make sure that it would survive and have some impact on future generations. She became a teacher later on in her life, and that was part of her mission, to teach. So with respect to the core story, we all know something about Emmett Till, and we're hearing more about him this week and certainly in recent weeks with respect to George Floyd, certainly, and other murders, if you will, of Black men. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old Chicago kid who traveled to Mississippi in August 1955 to visit friends, to visit relatives in the Mississippi Delta. It was to be the vacation of a lifetime. He saw in the open spaces of Mississippi this wonderful space for a kid who we discover in this book is quite bright, quite industrious, and also quite energetic. But somebody who, in his Chicago experience, lived basically a limitless life, a life of endless opportunities, and saw in the wide open spaces of the Mississippi Delta the chance to express himself. As we know, there was one fateful evening where he visited the store in Uptown, they called it Uptown Money, Mississippi, and had an encounter with a white woman, Carolyn Bryant, that led to his lynching. He whistled at Carolyn Bryant, and her husband and his half-brother came looking for Emmett in the middle of the night, kidnapped him, and over the course of several hours tortured him and finally murdered him. Dumped his body in the Tallahatchie River with a 75-pound gin fan tied around his neck with barbed wire. They dumped him in the Tallahatchie River, believing that no one would ever see his remains again. Interesting, and there is this spiritual note that Mother Mobley touches on. On the third day, his body rose again, and he was discovered by a young fisherman who saw his knees bobbing up in the water, and he was pulled from the river and identified by his uncle. The word got back to Mamie Till-Mobley, and she insisted that his body be returned to Chicago. Now, this was a critical decision in a transformative moment by a woman who was apolitical. As we write in the book, she was too naive to walk the streets alone. But in this moment, she was transformed. And it says something about the human spirit. It says something about the potential we all have. She made three critical decisions at the point of discovering that her son had been murdered. One, his body was to be buried immediately in Mississippi. They wanted to cover this up right away. He was ordered, his uncle was ordered to bury him before sundown that day he was discovered. She said, no, first decision, no, he's going to be returned to me. And so they returned his body in a box, casket in a box sealed with the seal of the state of Mississippi under orders that the box would not be opened. Her second critical decision was, of course, to open the box. And as she says in her interviews with me, I dared them to come to Chicago to haul me off for opening a box and identifying the remains of my son. And the third critical decision after identifying the remains was to have an open casket funeral. An open casket funeral in which Emmett's body lay in state for 4 days in a glass enclosed casket for an estimated 100,000 people to file by over the course of those 4 days and view the body. These were critical decisions because one, had he been buried in Mississippi, obviously we would know nothing more about this. Two, in putting his body on display, she allowed people to see what we had not been looking at for so long during this period of American apartheid, during which people were subject to terror, obviously in the South, but also in the North. And many people were activated by it. We've read the essay that was published after John Lewis's death, in which he writes that Emmett Till was his George Floyd, right? There were so many people who were Emmett's age at the time of his lynching who came of age during this early part of the civil rights movement. Reverend Jesse Jackson has said that this moment was the big bang of the civil rights movement. And this is something we talk about in the book. It was following Brown versus Board of Education and the sense of alarm in the South that so much was being lost, in the racist euphemism of the South, a way of life, and people were pushing back. this event and the trial of Emmett's killers, their acquittal, stimulated the resolve in the Montgomery bus boycott. And we know about Rosa Parks' stand in keeping her seat on that bus. She would say many years later, when she and Mamie Till-Mobley became friends, that she was thinking about Emmett in that moment. We talk more about that in the details of how that came to be a source of motivation and inspiration for all those people in the little better than a year of the Montgomery bus boycott. So what we see here is Brown versus Board of Education, the legal struggle for rights, for equal rights in this country, and the mass movement that grew out of Montgomery. And Emmett becomes the bridge between the legal struggle and the mass movement in ways that, of course, we discuss as well. The reason it's important for us to understand this is to fully contextualize the moment we're living through right now, and to understand that while so many things have changed, so little has changed with respect to systemic racism in this country. Emmett Till and his lynching is of the moment. George Floyd and his murder is of the moment. What do these moments mean? And in coming to understand the Emmett Till story, we have a deeper appreciation of all the stories that are unfolding right now. And not just that, but the spiritual journey of Mamie Till-Mobley inspires us to dig deep and understand the challenges we face, challenges of good citizenship in a democratic society, and what we're called upon to do to finally deliver on the promises of the founding of this country. So it's still a struggle. We're not there yet. Interestingly, with the election of Barack Obama, there was, I'm a journalist, so I can criticize my brothers and sisters in the profession who declared with the election of Barack Obama that we had finally reached that post-racial America. And in the, 15, 16 years since then, we have to ask ourselves whether we were a little too eager to declare that victory, because clearly a lot has happened since then that reminds us that we still have a long way to go. The Emmett Till story helps us to understand that. Should I read some of the passages that help to illustrate this?
And
okay.
Let me just add, I'm getting a lot of messages from people that they want me to disappear because we're on a split screen. This webinar is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to be interviewing Chris, and as such, you will see me. So just FYI.
Okay.
Yes, please read.
Okay. We saw one, heard one passage from the book, and I was trying to locate many. This is my war-torn copy of the book. It has been through the war. I don't know what war that was, but it certainly has been battle-tested. This was hot off the press when I got it. And the interesting thing about it is, as a journalist, I'm constantly finding stories to tell. And as you can see here, I've gotten this book autographed by all the critical players in the story, all of Emmett Till's family members who survived, his childhood friends who grew up with him and had wonderful stories to tell. Ethel Kennedy autographed it when we received the Kennedy Book Award. Mayor Daley signed it. So many people have autographed this. Yeah.
You told me last night that Mamie, that you had read chapters to Mamie. So even though she didn't get to see it published, she passed away, right, several months before, but she knew that it was on its, it was going to happen.
Yeah, the interesting thing about that is that we did quite an extensive book proposal that was considered by all the major houses in New York. And so in my detailed outline of the book, I had prepared for her chapters. Once we knew where the book was going, because of the detailed outline, I could write chapters all over the book. So I did a couple in the front, a couple in the middle, and then at the end. So she was able to see the arc of the story. And as I say, she was in terrible health. Her eyesight was failing. She was in dialysis 3 times a week. Her heart was giving out on her, and ultimately she did die of a heart attack. But in the course of preparing all of this, I was able to read to her the story that was going to carry her name. And again, she couldn't see it very well, so I was reading to her, and it was a remarkable experience for her not only to see the arc of the story, the beginning, middle, and end of it in Aristotelian terms, that is the story, right? But also to feel the story as she did, and to read this was probably the most incredible experience I had, sharing with her what was going to become her legacy. And to see out of the corner of my eye as I was reading to her a little chuckle at the funny parts, and there are those very human, warm and engaging parts, and then to see her wipe a tear from her eye at some of the really painful parts. And I have to say, I get choked up even thinking about that now, because as I was putting it all together, I would tear up, even as I was preparing the manuscript, writing some of the parts that you would least expect to bring you to tears. And that was some of the engaging early parts of the story, the mother and son story, because I knew where this piece was going. And that was part of our strategy, if you will, our writing strategy in presenting this to, as I say, humanize Emmett Till, but to help people understand what is lost in these cases. I mean, too often we see the news reports of people who are killed, and we understand the facts of it. We don't understand the meaning of it, and we certainly don't understand the enduring effect of what has been called a hate crime, right? The thing that people live with forever after that. And so to come to know Emmett is to come to know the pain of his loss, the pain that his mother lived with all of her life. And what we heard in the passage that Wendy read was something of that arc of the story and how she dealt with it. The family also has an enduring pain, and then the rest of us who identify with it. I'm currently working on another Emmett Till book, but also a Holocaust play. And in talking to people about the nature of that, we come to recognize in all of these horrific events of genocide that people live with this forever. Survivors are survivors of the atrocity, but carry with them the pain forever. And we get some of that in passages from the book, and I'll share this one with you because this one emerged at the 47th anniversary of Emmett's lynching. So this week will mark the 65th. On the 47th anniversary, I was going to visit Mother Mobley. We had all kinds of legal documents to sign, and her lawyer trusted me at this point to bring some documents to her. I decided to wait until the anniversary. I brought flowers because it seemed like the right thing to do. And I sat down with her, no recorder, no notes, no nothing. We've been talking for a few months at this point. And I noticed how despondent she was. And she said to me, you know, people call me on this day, and they always say, you know what this day is, right? And I tell them, I don't need reminders. I know this day. I'll never forget this day. And that became the inspiration for some of what you heard in the opening passage. But she also talked to me about what she saw in the remains she identified in Emmett and what that did for her. I had her go through that story repeatedly because I wanted her to explore what a mother would feel, not just the factual description of his body, which is the way she had become accustomed to telling it, which in a way was her insulation, right? And talking about the horrible condition of his body. An interviewer would hear that and shut down immediately because you don't want to deal with that. And I urged her to continue to talk about it, to explore what it meant for her to look at his knees and understand what it was like for him to be a polio survivor, for example, the memories that would engage. And at the very end of it, we came to this. I kept looking at him on the table, and I thought about what it must have been like for him that night. I studied every detail of what those monsters had done to destroy his beautiful young life. I thought about how afraid he must have been, how at some point that early Sunday morning, he must have known he was going to die. I thought about how all alone he must have felt, and I found myself hoping only that he died quickly. I can never forget what I saw on that table and how I felt. And I can never forget the complete devastation I experienced when I realized for the first time something that would haunt me for such a long time to come. At some point during his ordeal, in the last moments of his precious little life, Emmett must have cried out two names, God and Mama, and no one answered the call. And I listened, and as I mentioned, I was her co-author. I was an interviewer, but also in the course of documenting this story, I realized what a tremendous responsibility I had to help people contextualize this. And here you see the intersection of the horrible crime and her realization as a mother, and the sense of responsibility that she must have had that drove her through this transformative moment to become a civil rights leader, in a way, an inspiration in the civil rights movement. And so what it told me, as much as anything else, is that while we know there were two white supremacists, actually more we're documenting now, who came after Emmett, who killed him, they bear the responsibility for his murder. But somewhere, somehow, a mother is going to feel responsible as well. Did I do the right thing in letting him go down to Mississippi? Did I tell him enough about the circumstances? Had I prepared him enough in his 14 years of life to deal with these kinds of issues? When I started feeling nervous about him being there, should I have gone down to get him? What? Constantly a mother's going to struggle with that. And at the end of our experience together, which was in the religious holiday season in December 2002, just a week before her death, I was leaving her place, and she made it to the door with her walker, leaned up into a hug, and told me that the experience of telling the story and knowing that it was going to be preserved to her was cathartic. And I knew what she meant by that. What she meant was that she had finally found forgiveness for herself. And that was part of her journey. It was the significant part of her journey. Now, again, this story also helps us to understand how there are so many people, so many individuals who made critical contributions to the civil rights movement, because we see that playing out in the life and the courage of Mamie Till-Mobley. His killers, Emmett's killers, were arrested and they were put on trial. They were put on trial about 3 weeks after his murder. And you can understand that that was remarkably short a period of time to mount a murder investigation and put on a trial. So this obviously became a show trial at a critical political moment in our history, and that's another story. But certainly we were in the Cold War, and this country was struggling to win the hearts and minds of the global South, particularly in Africa. Countries were struggling for their independence and trying to decide whether they're going to go the route of the Soviet Union and communism or American democracy. And a lot of that decision depended on how they saw people of color being treated in this country. So there's a rush to show the world that we could have some semblance of justice. And obviously that was not the case here because his killers were acquitted. But we saw in this moment a huge media event. David Halberstam, noted journalist, covered the trial. This is one of his first big assignments. And later on in his book, The 50s, he wrote that this was the first big media event of the civil rights movement. National, international press were there. They said it was actually bigger than the Bruno Hauptmann baby kidnapping case, Lindbergh kidnapping case. And so we comment on that. And what was happening here at the moment we're discovering the horrors of Jim Crow, of American apartheid, and as television was coming of age. And suddenly we see this moment where the civil rights movement becomes a story for the media. We're in the television age now, and the media had seen the light. Many of the reporters who covered that travesty in Mississippi had been awakened to the great social and legal injustices confronting us. These were hard things to forget, and injustice would be a recurring theme playing out in the months and years to come. Those people down there in Mississippi thought they could stage manage a trial and force people to accept their warped version of reality. They thought wrong. Those lawyers down in Mississippi figured they had stopped the NAACP in its tracks. they miscalculated. They might have won a battle, but they were about to lose the war. Things would never be the same again. No one would plead ignorance. Everyone had to take responsibility for what our society had become. Anyone who did anything to make it happen, anyone who did nothing to stop it from happening. There could no longer be any innocent bystanders. For an entire nation, the murder of Emmett Till marked the death of innocence. And of course, that is the title of the book. She loved the title because she saw it operating on 3 levels. Obviously, the death of this innocent kid, 14 years old, the death of her own innocence in the sense that you have to sacrifice your innocence for higher consciousness, for higher awareness. And of course, the death of innocence of this country, we could no longer ignore this harsh reality. One more passage, because this was to illustrate the arc of her story and what she came to see, which ties into the beginning. This is the end of the story. Hopefully I have left each life a little better than I found it. Hopefully I've made a difference. That is, after all, how our lives are measured, by how many other lives we touch and inspire, by how much of life we embrace, not by what we reject, by what we accept, not by what we judge. Still, even with this understanding of a lifetime, the tears do flow from time to time, but I see much more clearly now through my tears, and that is a good thing. Rainy days always help us appreciate the sunny ones so much more, don't they? Besides, it is in crying that we are able to let go. In letting go, I have experienced what it is like to bring hope from despair, joy from anguish, forgiveness from anger, love from hate. And if I can do it, I know anyone can. And if everyone does it, just imagine how much better we all can be. The interesting thing about this is that on the last month of her life, she spent advocating for the abolition of the death penalty, because she saw the death penalty and particularly the impact on the Black community in unjust sentences, unfair convictions, as a new form of lynching. And she participated in panel discussions, and she made presentations with other victims' families. And Governor Ryan, then Governor Ryan, heard this. And on the day of her funeral, January 11th, 2003, while we were funeralizing Mamie Till-Mobley, Governor Ryan freed the people on death row, and he mentioned her by name. So the point of this is that obviously each of us has a purpose in life. That's what she talked about. She was blessed, as she would put it. I put lucky at one point in a draft, and she corrected it because she was spiritual. She felt blessed that she had been able to find her purpose in life. And she taught for many years so many students in the Chicago public school system to help them understand our history, but also our duty, our responsibility, and to lock onto their purpose in order to go out and fulfill it to make this country a better place. And so that, in a nutshell, is the story of Mamie Till-Mobley, as she uses the story of her son. As we put it, she mined her grief for a mission in life and was able to overcome that and to inspire so many other people to get involved. It changed my life to work with her on this book, and I have committed my work, my journalism, to social justice. I'm also a lawyer, as you heard. So to me, I consider this to be a high form of advocacy. And it's one we share with our students at Medill, because we have a social justice specialization in our graduate program. And we help them to understand the importance of context in telling the stories that we're telling now, so that people understand why there are people out in demonstrations, not just the fact of it, but the meaning of it. And so that's what Emmett Till has given us. And with that, I can take a break because I know we're going to talk, we're going to have a conversation now, and I'm looking forward to that.
Thank you. We have some questions that I'll get to later, but it was interesting to hear you describe, yeah, and their, the and it struck me reading, you know, everything about the trial, which was really a sham trial, filled with all kinds of indignities to the Black population there and the Black journalists attending. But it really, it was like we were in two different countries, two different planets. And that's where she had her second thoughts, you know, about had she prepared him enough. And you know, the rest of the United States, the Midwest, and certainly the East Coast, had no idea that the things that were taking place during the trial would even exist. And, you know, how they referred to the Black people called to the stand. There were all these unspoken rules of what Black people were allowed to do and not allowed to do. And it was just very, very hard to read.
Yeah, it is. You can imagine what it was like for me to write.
Coming down to Mississippi, wanting to watch. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I didn't make it during the time of the writing because I had a really quick turnaround on the book.
Right.
We had set a deadline of April 1st of 2003 because we knew she was in poor health and we wanted to get the book out while she was still around to go out and talk about it. You know, 3 months after her death, I had to produce a 100,000 page manuscript. So I didn't have time to travel. I had to live this. It probably was better that I didn't because I was relying on her descriptions and the descriptions of his cousins, his friends, other people who had lived through the experience. And I was able to be true to the story as she told it. I have since been down there and I've seen all the places that figure into the story, including the courthouse, which has been restored. I was there for a reenactment of the trial. And I saw Black Bayou where his body was thrown over the bridge and into the water. So yeah, that certainly, you can't be in places like that without being affected by them. I mentioned the Holocaust piece. I traveled last summer to Auschwitz-Birkenau and Plaszow, the concentration camp that's featured in Schindler's List, which is the core of my story that I'm writing. And you can't be in spaces like that without feeling the pain that still exists in the very soil of these places. So I know what it was like for her to be there, to be at a courthouse where, you know, there's a Confederate statue that still stands out front and where all the hostile white people who couldn't get into the courtroom would stand and heckle, jeer, and threaten the Black witnesses who were coming in. Black witnesses who, by the way, had to leave Mississippi immediately after their testimony to come to Chicago to escape. So yeah, this was an introduction. And the important thing is, and I talk about this in other presentations on the media and the media role in civil rights, this was an eye-opener for many professional reporters as well. Many of the journalists at the time were Southerners. They had come out of the South to fight in World War II. So coming back from an experience of fighting against authoritarian regimes, they began to see their native land in a different way. Something that they had gotten used to because it was, in that racist euphemism, a way of life, right? Nobody thought to question these things before, and now that's all they could do. And so there's a reason why the civil rights movement that emerged, the actual mass movement that emerged in Montgomery became a media event, because people who saw the Emmett Till, the injustice of the Emmett Till lynching and trial, saw it in so many other ways throughout the civil rights movement. So it became a huge media event. And as television grew as a medium that we accepted, it came into our living rooms. We saw the injustices unfolding right there. And it was hard not to get involved in some way, even if it was just to cast a vote for policy makers who would make a difference. So yes, it was transformative for her. It was transformative for all the people there. Some of the leaders of the civil rights movement were there. Medgar Evers was there. This was his, he had just become the field secretary of the NAACP in Mississippi. And this was his first investigation. Other people like John Lewis saw the case unfold in the reporting that was going on. John Lewis was 15 at the time. I've talked to so many other activists who were about Emmett's age at this point, and they all, were struck by the realization that it could have been them. But here's the thing that took a while to really sink in with people. Yeah, we looked at the South and the intensity of the resistance to progress in the South, because it played out there in ways that it hadn't played out anywhere else. But people slowly began to realize that this was not just a Southern problem. There's a strain of history now, a body of history that deals with this notion of Southern exceptionalism, that the South was not unique in that regard. Many years later, Malcolm X would say the Mason-Dixon line is the Canadian border. And so what we began to see was in different terms, the same structures of race and racism played out throughout the country. And we talk about that in the book as well. I imagine there are members of this group who can remember Marshall Field. And some of us protested for a long time and didn't shop at Macy's on State Street because they changed the name. One of the best department stores ever. And when Mamie tried to shop there, she had to go into the basement. This is Marshall Field, this is Chicago, because she was Black. So we see this problem unfolding everywhere. And I think it's been an eye-opener for people in the media to recognize that racism is a systemic issue and that it exists everywhere in this country. And so what I've been able to come to appreciate through the Emmett Till story is that race is certainly a key element of this horrific crime and of all the crimes we see here, but race is only an element of it. And too often we stop at the question of whether someone is racist or not. That question has been put to Donald Trump throughout his administration. And my argument is that that is not the essential question. The essential question goes to an understanding of power and how power is allocated in our society. So to come back to the central point of your question, Black people were dehumanized in this country throughout its history in a way to justify their lower status in this power hierarchy. Because defining identity in oppositional ways, I can only be good if I hold myself up against something that's bad in all the other attributes of our character. Good, bad, honest, dishonest, smart, stupid. In this identity construction, we have come to see people of color in a lower status, in dehumanized status. And once you have dehumanized a person, it makes it a lot easier for you to take that person's life. And that's what happened in the period of spectacle lynching. The reason we have so many photographs of spectacle lynchings is that white people who attended these lynchings sent the photographs out as postcards to their relatives in distant spaces in this country to illustrate, to demonstrate the power of white people over the Black body. In the case of Mamie Till-Mobley, we know that there was a famous set of pictures of Emmett's remains, his horribly mutilated remains. And in that moment, when she decides to allow a photographer to shoot those pictures and to have them published, she has, again, started this transformational period that flips the script, if you will. And now Black people are taking control of the image of the horrors of racism in order to activate people.
Yes, all that is true. And you offer a great oversight to everything that took place. Along with that, I would like to read a paragraph from the book that talks about this power dynamic. before I do that, we haven't mentioned that after the trial, and for those of you who don't know all the details, Emmett may or may not have said whatever he said, may or may not have whistled. He stuttered, and whistling helped him get over, with his stuttering. But whatever took place or did not take place was on one particular day. And I think it was, I don't remember if it was that night or the next night, but hours had passed. He was staying with his uncle. He was in bed. It was 2 a.m. And these people came to the door. They came in and they told Emmett's uncle, "I'm looking for a black kid from Chicago." And the uncle tried to keep them away, but he was powerless in his own home. And they got Emmett. He was sound asleep. They woke him up. He got partially dressed. I don't think they let him put his shoes on. And he had no idea what was taking place. And they took him outside, took him over to the truck. A female voice said, "Yeah, that's him." And then the two white men that had come into the home, turned around to Emmett's uncle and said, "How old are you?" "I'm 63. If you want to live to see 64, I was never here. You don't know me." And even though, of course, he knew them. And with that, they left. And, the brazenness of it, to go into someone else's home and just take a person and threaten them for telling, that was horrible enough. And they admitted to kidnapping. So the verdict, the jury took a little more than an hour, like an hour and 20 minutes, to come back with not guilty. And then a few years later, a reporter, a journalist from Look magazine, paid them money to interview them, where they both admitted, yes, that they had killed him. But because of double jeopardy, they could not be charged with anything. But they admitted it and they justified it. And so it's after this period that I'm reading a section from the book. And the two killers were Bryant and Millam. One thing about the Bryant and Millam version that is striking, Millam boasts about killing Emmett to teach him a lesson and also to send a message to others. Whatever happened in that store and money, whatever was said to have happened, whatever grew out of the imagination of people who saw it, who told the story over and over again, the fact remains that Millam saw it as his duty as a white man to send that message. And sending a message to Black folks is one of the key factors that distinguishes a lynching from a murder. And what do you say after that? It was, and the woman who accused them later recanted, years and years later.
Yeah, well, and we see echoes of that, don't we, with the Central Park accusation. The woman, Cooper, threatens to call the police, and I'm going to say it's a Black man who's harassing me, knowing, right, in this contemporary moment, knowing what that still is going to mean. And so the accusation was all it took. And so many of the lynchings during this long period of lynchings of nearly 5,000 people, that's all it ever took. Somebody, as Emmett's cousin, the Reverend Wheeler Parker says, reckless eyeballing could get you lynched. You look at somebody the wrong way. So there is that, but there also is something else in that discussion, which I found is one of the more ridiculous moments during the ramp up to the trial until I fully understood the context of it. And that is the discourse, which is kind of touched on there. You read the payoff of it, you know, whether this was a lynching or a murder. And the question I asked initially is, what difference does it make? I mean, when you experience the horrible things that were done to Emmett Till, but with the description of his remains, you have to ask yourself whether it really makes a difference. Well, it does. It does in the context that we've set out in this story and that I've done ever since then in my public talks and my writing, that it becomes political if it's a lynching. And I referred to the spectacle lynchings, the period where we see the images of people who have been hanged, mutilated in so many ways, the ritualistic nature of it. And we tend to think that it's only a lynching if we see someone hanging from a tree or a lamppost. A lynching is something bigger than that. And this certainly was a lynching. Lynching as defined these days as a ritualistic killing by a group of 3 or more people, and it's meant to send a message. Okay, so someone might or might not have done something that could be actionable. Due process is never a part of this, so nobody is tried and convicted and punished. You strictly go from a suspicion to the punishment, and you know, ultimately the point of it is awfully medieval in the sense of head on a spike kind of medieval displays of warnings for people not to step out of line. So this whole process of identity formation, othering, dehumanizing certain people to establish their place in our society. And if the majority population feels you've stepped out of your place, then that construct has to be enforced. And how is it enforced? It's enforced through stereotypes to reinforce the demeaning nature of your identity. It's enforced through intimidation and threats like burning crosses on people's lawns. And if you don't get the message through that series of, you know, through this continuum, then ultimately physical violence up to and including murder, that's a lynching. And that lynching is done in order to warn other people not to step out of their assigned place in our society. So you begin to see it in that context to understand the other crimes that we're seeing unfold now. It's an assertion of white power, if you will, at a time that's not unlike the 1950s. In the 1950s, I mentioned Brown versus Board of Education. People in the South in particular were alarmed because this thing that the Supreme Court had done threatened their way of life. And the second ruling in Brown, which came down the summer, Emmett Till traveled to Mississippi, was the implementation order with all deliberate speed, which means something different than what people took it to mean. It sounds like it means hurry up. Tomorrow, little black boys are going to be sitting next to little white girls in schoolhouses, and the day after that, they're going to run off and get married. You know, I mean, this was the threat to white power at the time. But deliberate speed means just the opposite of that. It means wait, slow down, deliberate, think about it. And as we know, it took many years, a decade really, for some kind of civil rights enforcement in this country. But the point is that power hierarchy was being threatened. And anyone who stepped out of line, out of their assigned place, threatened that. And they had to be pushed back in the most public way. So that's what Emmett Till is all about. In some ways, that's what George Floyd is all about. We have an image of Emmett Till, his mutilated remains in the casket. And this sense that, as you described, that white people believe they could get away with this. Of course we can do this because these are not people, okay? Nobody's gonna value them. And we see the image on the video recording of this officer, Chauvin, kneeling on the neck of George Floyd and looking straight into the camera with this chilling expression of indifference. as if to say, what are you going to do? What can you do? I have the power to do this, and I know what I'm doing. I mean, that's how you interpret that. So we have to ask ourselves, what has changed? What do we make of this moment? We understand the history of this country through stories like this. I think it gives us a deeper appreciation of our duty. Mine as a writer is to continue to explore these stories, but we all have something we can do, and we have to think about that. It could be voting. We do have an election coming up. That's important.
But, you know, it's striking to me that the photograph is what really expanded this story. And it's the video of George Floyd that so enraged people. Without the photograph, this story could have died out very quickly. And throughout it, it's almost forgotten that he was a child. He was tall and he was well built, but he was still a kid. And yeah, she says, I had seen, the whole nation had to bear witness to this. And even what was shown in the casket had been cleaned up. It was not as bad as what she saw when she identified him.
Part of what you just read dropped out, but so people know what you read. The first part of that was, you know, the world had to see what I had seen. She basically, that was her rationale for the open casket, the glass-topped casket. And it's important because, as you pointed out, without that image, you know, how would this have turned out? Without the video with George Floyd, how would that turn out? We don't know yet, but we know now that at least some charges have been levied. An indictment for indictments have been levied, and so, you know, what does this mean in the final analysis? What it means is it's part of that process. Part of the process of othering, of dehumanizing, is also to discredit. There were Black witnesses at the trial who testified and identified, not just his uncle and that famous photograph of his uncle pointing out the people in the courtroom who came to his house and abducted his nephew, but you also had witnesses who said they saw the accused at the barn of the shed where they were beating Emmett to death. They heard the screams coming out of the barn. They are not even mentioned in that article. You talked about a Look magazine article where the writer strategically left them out because they didn't count. Their views didn't count. So without the photograph, without the video, what do we have? We have the testimony of African Americans whom nobody believes. And that's what's been happening for years as people in the African American community say, we've been suffering as a result of the abuse of power, because that's what this comes down to, the abuse of power by police in our community. And nobody's listening to them until they see the video. And that is what has energized people, the atrocity of it, and now the proof of it. But we have to ask ourselves why we discounted the views of so many people who said this was going on for so long. And what does that tell us about how we need to rethink our relationships with respect to moving forward? We're standing on the cusp of a new demographic reality in this country. And that's what I was touching on earlier. It's not unlike the 50s with Brown versus Board of Education redefining our legal and social relationships. We're at a point now where we have to consider that all over again as we see in the near future. White is no longer going to be the majority in this country. In fact, there's not going to be a racial or ethnic majority. This is truly going to become a plural society. And clearly there are some people having some real problems navigating this new terrain. And you see how they're we're responding to that in so many irrational ways. How do we have a discourse that's going to help people understand that we don't have to be in a zero-sum game of power in this country, that we can share power, and that's what a democratic society is all about.
Very well put. I would like to, we have lots of questions from the audience. I would like to share those with you now.
Hopefully I'll have lots of answers.
You will. Gwen says, when Mrs. Till-Mobley died, was she satisfied that she'd completed the journey she began when she sent for her son's body from Mississippi, and how she changed and educated our country?
The only thing I can say is what her lawyer said to me on the night of her death, and he encouraged me to continue the process to finish the book. As he put it, the only way she could close her eyes was to know that this was going to be done. So that combined with what she said to me at the door, that anecdote I shared with you, suggests to me that she did feel that her mission had been completed.
I read later that the store clerk stated that Emmett didn't whistle at her. Is that story true?
No, he did whistle. The issue was how we interpret the whistle, and his cousins who were there say that it was a prank. Emmett Till, if you know about him, we describe him in the book as 200% boy. He was very active, very energetic, very adventurous, but also mischievous. And once you come to understand him, you see that playing out there. You know, I identified with that because of all the trouble I had when I was a little boy. And so I came to really understand that, but that's the story. So we Rashomon that in the sense that we tell three different versions of the whistle. One you heard, as you recounted, Wendy, his mother's version, that because of polio, he had damage to his vocal cords and had a terrible stutter. So he couldn't possibly have said all the things that Carolyn Bryant accused him of saying. That was not even possible. But she said that he whistled to steady his voice. That's one version. Another version, somebody who was there said he whistled at a bold checker move that was being played out on the porch there. And then the final version is the cousins who say that he whistled as a prank. But she did hear it.
Okay. On what grounds were the murderers acquitted?
First of all, even though the jury was sequestered and didn't hear the testimony of the woman, Carolyn Bryant, who described in great detail all the things that she said Emmett had done, which, you know, when you hear them sound like an attempted rape. And the cousins who were there said he wasn't in there long enough. And, you know, that story had actually developed over time. The first time she told it, none of that was in the story. So that was told in open court, even though the jury had been excused during the time. But we have evidence that people were visiting the jurors in their hotel room and sharing what was happening. So there was that part of it. What one academic describes as, in the Southern culture at the time, what was considered to be justifiable homicide. If you did this, then you deserve to die. But what the jury publicly said was that the prosecution, the state, had not established that the remains pulled from the river were in fact Emmett. And as we discussed in the book, the sheriff who was supposed to investigate the murder wound up working for the defendants. And he began that narrative by saying there's no way that that could have been Emmett Till's body. And in fact, Emmett Till is still alive and walking around somewhere. We're going to find him. And so the jury was able to fix on that. And that was their public explanation for why they acquitted, that they didn't establish that Emmett had even been killed, let alone that these people killed him.
And yet they gave the remains to a black undertaker.
Yeah, we talk about this in the book as well. The sheriff actually perjured himself on the stand and testified under examination that he had not been able to identify Emmett Till as a Negro. or as Emmett Till, or even as related to the people who were claiming his remains. And yes, he had released the body to a black undertaker. So if he's not black, why would you do that? But more to the point, he said that he had not done that with respect to the death certificate that he is supposed to issue. He said that he had not issued it at that point. He had not signed off on it. And we found the death certificate, and it shows that he had actually signed it 2 weeks before the trial and had identified the victim as Emmett Till, a Negro. This is on the death certificate, certified it, and even the cause of death, which is expressed on the death certificate as an axe or a gun. And apparently the body was so brutalized that cutting and shooting were both factors. But he swore under oath that he had not done that, and it's just that he had not issued the death certificate until after the trial. So it wasn't until after that testimony that Mamie found the truth. We have a picture of the death certificate in the book as well, so you can see it.
What was the verdict of the reenactment of the trial?
Guilty. The reenactment was by students, high school students from West Virginia, which is an interesting element of this story, and the fact that it resonates across race and gender. Students in a high school in West Virginia took this up as a project under guidance of their teacher, who was a journalist, by the way, and he wanted them to reenact the trial by way of the transcript that was discovered much later. And so they, Wheeler Parker, the cousin I mentioned, arranged to have them come to Sumner, Mississippi, where the original trial was held, in the original courthouse. And over the course of a couple of days, they reenacted the trial. And all the same testimony that was included in the original trial up to the verdict, which, if you look at the weight of the evidence, the students ruled in a way that the jury refused to, and found that the defendants were guilty.
Alice Akre shares this story. James McCosh, the school that Emmett attended before his brutal murder, was renamed Emmett Till. Alice attended this school from 1953 to 1962. Maria would like to know, how did you decide to write this book?
Okay, first on the school, I was there when they rededicated it as Emmett Till Academy. And his mother, after she became a teacher, wound up teaching there for a few years. So that was quite an extraordinary experience as well.
And that's in the Chicago area, or
it's in Chicago.
Mississippi? Okay.
Yeah. It is the school he attended, and obviously, was it Marie you said who?
Alice.
Alice. I'd like to meet Alice one day. It's kind of an interesting story. I mean, as with so many young Black kids, I learned something about the Emmett Till lynching from a relative who had saved one of the copies of Jet magazine, as so many Black families did, to share with young kids over the course of a generation or two, to warn us about the dangers that were lurking out there. And so it became our stranger danger story, right? This is what white people can do to you. So I saw the pictures and I was horrified by them, but that was the only thing I knew, that this kid, who could have been me, was killed in the most horrible way. And so stay away from white people. Later on in college, I would hear the name Emmett Till in connection with the civil rights movement, but nothing more than that. And later still, I was Washington editor of Ebony, and I talked to my bureau chief, Simeon Booker, who was one of the reporters who actually covered the trial and was responsible for arranging with Mamie Till-Mobley to have the pictures taken and published in Jet magazine. So I'm developing a deeper understanding of the facts of it. But it wasn't until I met Mother Mobley that I became connected to the story and the challenge of writing the book. I was introduced to her by some other people who were interested in turning her story into a motion picture. And one of them was a playwright, a noted playwright in Chicago, David Barr, who had worked with her in transforming her story into a stage play, which had great notices. And so he went back to her at the urging of somebody who was connected to Steven Spielberg, who wanted to turn this into a motion picture. So he brought me in because I had written a novel and he knew I knew how to write stories and blah, blah, blah. So we sat down with her and started talking about the possibility of doing a movie. And then she found out that I had written a book, I had written a novel, and I was about to write my second novel. And so suddenly the entire conversation shifted. She turned to me and said, basically, forget about the movie. I've always wanted to write a book. And you can understand that. As a teacher, she valued the power of books, one, to endure over time. And she looked forward to the opportunity to tell her story. What I discovered was that she had tried to do this with so many people over the years, and she knew she was running out of time. So this was kind of a desperation move on her part to just latch on to somebody she thought could write a book. And I decided in all of a split second that this could be the most important thing I would ever do. And so I decided in that fraction of a moment that I would put aside the novel and work on this. So the next day I called my agent and told him, and he locked onto it immediately, and that's how it started. And so again, I could have told her that I was about to write another book and I would come back to her in 6 months. We wound up working immediately and putting her story together. This was June 2002. January 2003, she was gone. So 6 months later, we would have lost this story altogether if I had waited. And I am moved by that realization every time I think about it, that, you know, just what brought me to the story, certainly, but what made it the most compelling thing I could do at that moment, and to work like crazy over the 6 months that we had together to preserve it. So that's how it happened.
Approximately how many hours did you spend with her?
You know, I can't ever remember that, but I know during the course of developing the proposal, we worked together for a couple of months during that summer, immediately from June 2002. And so I would visit her and record the interviews, most of them, for an hour to 2 hours at a time over the course of what became the last 6 months of her life. So it's hard to say, because in between those recorded sessions, those formal sessions, we would talk on the phone, and we talk sometimes for up to an hour where she would lay a story on me. And it was clear that she knew that there was something compelling about doing this. So all I can say is over the course of 6 months, several hours at a time, we would talk at least a few times a week so that we could make sure that we got it together. So I have to go back and try to quantify that. But it was a lot. It was a lot. But then after that, after she died, I didn't have her to do the fact checking to double and triple check the things that she had said. You know, she was 80 when we met, 81 when she died, and her birthday was in November that year, during the 6 months, and I had to check. I'm a journalist, so you know, if your mother tells you she loves you, check it out, right? That's our rule. And so, if this mother was telling me what a wonderful kid this Emmett Till was, if she was telling me that it was 9 o'clock in the morning when something happened, I had to make sure that it happened that way. So after she was gone, I had to check with so many people. I must have done, oh my gosh, dozens of additional interviews to double check all the things that she had told me during the course of the time we had together. So more time obviously was invested in the 3 months that I had to turn the book around. Even as I was writing, I was on the phone with people, double checking. It's funny too, because my agents were trying to strike a movie deal even before the book was done. And I'm like, you guys leave me alone. This is something I need to do. So it's hard to say how much time I put into it. It was a considerable amount of time.
Do you still have the tapes with her voice?
I do. They're in a safe deposit box.
Good.
Yeah.
Paula would like to know, were women lynched?
Yes.
Linda asks, is it true that the word lynch comes from a person's name?
Yes. a state senator in the South in the 19th century, who advocated violence against Black people as an enforcement, Reconstruction and on, to preserve white power in the South. And this is how it got translated. Yeah.
Okay. Several people have asked about the picture, the painting behind you. Could you tell us about the painting?
Yeah, my sister's an artist, and she did that as a gift to me. And so, yeah, she, just to put her in context, my sister, I don't know if people know children's books, but American Girl has done a series of girl heroes, different ethnic groups. And Addie was one of the stories of an enslaved family. And the little girl finds her freedom in Philadelphia. And my sister was the illustrator on that series and did another series on a Black Raggedy Ann doll. So she's done children's books and illustrations. And now her daughter, her oldest daughter, is doing the same thing. So there's the story for Emmett Till. Yeah.
Does it have, is that Emmett Till?
That's a depiction of Emmett Till. She does sort of a montage of Emmett. The stores in the background, you can see there, the train, and some of the images that come from the story.
Interesting. What is your sister's name? And just
Melody Rosales. She at the urging of her older brother, she started putting Benson in her name, so it's Melody Benson Rosales.
Okay. Esther asked, did any of the jurors ever regret the verdict?
Not publicly.
And the killers never apologized or showed any remorse?
No. An interesting piece of our story was Mamie talking about getting on the phone with a shock jock who actually called Roy Bryant later in life and just wanted her to listen in. And she said she listened as the conversation opened up, and the shock jock said to Roy Bryant, I'm calling you to talk about Emmett Till. And he, with a bunch of expletives, said, I don't want to talk about Emmett Till unless you're going to bring me a barrel of money. Emmett Till ruined my life.
Okay. Esther asks, how do you see this connection with religion?
Well, faith certainly drove Mamie Till-Mobley. I call her Mother Mobley because she was a church mother, which is a rank in the Black church. She, there was constant prayer that allowed her to survive. And there was the sense of religious purpose to do good, to find forgiveness, and to help elevate people in their consciousness and their awareness and their faith. And somehow that got merged with the political agenda at the time. She was surrounded by significant civil rights and labor leaders who were able to inspire her to translate that religious grounding into something of her mission in life. So her faith certainly carried her forward. She talked about Emmett Till in spiritual terms. I talked about his discovery of his body on that third day after his lynching. She also described Emmett at times as the sacrificial lamb of the civil rights movement. So there is all of this contextualizing in her view of the world in religious terms, but that segs into the political agenda that became the story of Emmett Till.
And reading, her transformation without her firm belief in God, she would not have survived. It sustained her. It gave her strength when she needed it. And she describes those incidents.
Yeah, you're alluding to a passage in the book where she talks about um, getting close to committing suicide. And in that moment, obviously it's her spirituality which pulls her back from the brink, but also a reflection on some children she sees playing down in front of her house where she was about to open a window and, basically end it all. What would happen? How would those children be transformed? What is the message they would get from that, and how from that, what is my duty to those children? And so it was her spirituality which pulled her back, but also discovering that there was something important for her to do. And we can see that people who have spent time with the Old and New Testament will appreciate, the stories of people who discover their purpose, what it all represents. So she clearly was saved by her religion.
She also had a very, very strong family structure. Her mother was the rock of the family. Her second husband adored her, protected her. She had a whole community that was there for her. But those three decisions you talked about at the beginning, reading about how she made them and what she was thinking about was kind of astounding, because you see her grow. She is confronted with unfathomable choices, and from her gut, she didn't ask anybody. She just made these decisions, and it was kind of amazing to watch.
And we talk about that. I mean, at a certain point, there are all these voices in her life at this moment, but the voice that seems to have dominated is the voice of God, because she begins to appreciate her experience, appreciate in the sense of understanding it, through her religious indoctrination, and finding some peace in that moment, finding some resolve in that moment, the courage to move forward, and the message that she takes with her. It's interesting because at one point, I hesitate to put me in this story, but at one point, she looked up at me, and it's sort of a giddy moment when we were reading passages in the book, and she said, "I really like how this shows me coming into my own." And there was a flash of that early naivete that I think we captured in the early part of the book as well. But she was so proud of that we were able to show this transformation, not so much because of any ego gratification on a personal level, but what she knew that would represent to other people, that we all have that in us. How we discover that is something we have to experience, but just to know that it's there challenges us to search for it and to affect it in some way in our society. So the Emmett Till story, I think, I believe, challenges us to step up.
I didn't hear what you said.
Oh, I said the Emmett Till story challenges us to step up in the way we render this piece, and do it in a way that doesn't just tell the facts of the story, but contextualizes it in socio-political terms, certainly, but also in these spiritual terms, helps to represent something that she discovered in her own life, and talking it through with me. And there's a whole talk we could have about how I approach my work, but something of a psychiatrist as well as a writer, but in talking through these things to discover that deep power that she had, that she was able to effect in ways that helped to move us forward. demonstrates for people that we all have that. That we all have this unique gift to share with the world, and we have to discover it and put it into effect.
Right. Jean says that Emmett Till's casket is on display in a special room at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C.
Yes.
Okay. Did Emmett's uncles and cousins remain in the town in Mississippi?
Some did, but not the ones who testified. The relatives who testified had to leave. Yeah, they left within days of the verdict.
Yeah.
I mean, they got rid of everything. You know, sold what they could, packed what they could, left what they had to.
She tells the story of how after the trial, she got in a car, she and her dad got in a car and were going back to the airport. And when they were in the car, the person sending them off said to the driver, "Do you know who you have back there?" And he looked back and he didn't know. And he was told Emmett Till's mom and his grandfather. And he was so mad, so upset, because those two people put him in such danger. He took all back roads. He didn't use his headlights sometimes. He was terrified. He couldn't wait to get rid of them. And that was just very jolting.
And, you know, to some extent that consciousness still exists in the South, in the North, certainly in the South. And we've seen some evidence of that, even with the reenactment. There was concern about even attending it in some sectors. There was some white pushback. Yeah, so.
Marcia would like to know, have you met or spoken to any of his former classmates?
Yes. In fact, one of the pages I shared with you bears the signatures of about 8 of his childhood friends, some cousins, but also people who were in school with him.
Okay. This is from Guy. In 2007, the FBI released the results of their Emmett Till investigation. A few years ago, after Tim Tyson's book apparently revealed Carolyn Bryant's confession that she embellished her testimony. Her confession was not recorded and is not contested by Bryant's daughter. The FBI started to reinvestigate the Emmett Till case. Do you know anything about the status of the FBI's latest investigation?
Yes, I do. And I can't really talk about that because that's what I'm writing about now.
Okay, good reason to buy the book. When is it expected?
the next one, yeah.
This
one and the next one, yeah.
This one. Booked Evanston on Main Street is offering a 10% discount if you buy from them instead of Amazon. So, when do you expect your new book?
I signed a bunch of.
That's right. You can get signed copies. Absolutely. And support a local bookstore. When is your new book expected to be available for consumption?
We're not sure yet.
Okay.
It's going to depend on, the publisher. It's also Random House. So, yeah. So
when you're ready, when it's about to be published or has been published, please come back. It's an open invitation. We would love to hear about it.
Happy to do that. And maybe by then we can meet face to face. So.
That's true.
Yeah.
Is there anything you regret not discussing with Mrs. Mobley?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, at the time the manuscript was completed in April of 2003. It was published, it was released in October of that year. I felt satisfied that I had covered everything, but my experience is that 5 minutes after I write something, I see the world differently, and I might have, expressed something in a different way, or I might have seen something in a different way. There was so much more I wanted to talk to her about. some of it might have been factual, and I did have an opportunity to cover that with, other people. Some of it was just impressionistic because, again, I said something about the way I work. One of the things I do in interviewing people is to talk, but to have a conversation, not just to ask questions, and to reflect on things they're saying, and sometimes to feed it back to them in ways that I'm interpreting it, that help them to see it in a different light. And once they take ownership of that, that becomes their story. So there were other things that I would have liked to have shared with her to see how she felt about it. But since then, I mean, it's been, 17 years since we wrote the book. I see the whole world differently, right? I see this in context, and I have taught courses that flow from that consciousness. So the next book will reflect that growth. This one certainly stands on its own. And I think it's you said what you said about it, and I think it's important for people to experience. The next one will be as well, but the next one will reflect all the things that I've thought about since then, with through the lens of Emmett's cousin, Wheeler Parker, a survivor of that night of terror, who is the pastor of the church that Emmett Till's grandmother helped to build. So it'll be told through his lens.
Okay. What is the story of Emmett's father at the point of his death?
Emmett's biological father?
His biological father, they separated very early in their relationship, and he went into the Army.
Yeah.
And he died there. And
he was abusive, and as part of the court determination of the divorce and the protection order, he was given a choice: you either go to jail or you go to war. And so he chose going into the Army. Lewis Till is his name. And Emmett never knew him. He was just an infant when he left. And you're right, he died in the European theater. But there were stories that emerged about that. He was basically, I'm getting a poll here.
Yeah, that's it's
I'll
for
move
all
it out of
the
the way.
attendees.
Yeah.
It's,
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll move it out of the way. Excellent. Yes. Okay. But he was court-martialed, charged with rape and murder in Italy, and there's been some question about that, and that's a whole other story. But that became an issue in the trial of the two defendants.
Yes, the defense brought that out as a surprise, as see what happens. It's genetic,
like father, like son.
Father, like son. And his Army mates all said that those were trumped up charges. There were times when, it was the same as in Mississippi. Someone could accuse you, and you would never see them again.
Yeah, or even not accuse you. And since we opened this up, I can tell, because that's a compelling story too, and other people have written about it. Some have included the story of Lewis Till, including John Edgar Whitman, who wrote a book about Lewis Till. So briefly, what you had during the Second World War were segregated troops, and the Army, the military felt that the best way to control the black troops was to put white Southerners in charge as NCOs or commanding officers, because they knew how to deal with their black people. And so what would happen is there was fraternization in Europe. All the enlisted people were part of that. And but when black enlisted personnel would date white women, that offended the white Southern commanding officers. That's not to say that there weren't crimes. There were books that were written about the crimes of U.S. soldiers against women in Europe. But the percentage of Black enlisted people who were court-martialed and executed for these crimes was way out of line with what appears to be the occurrence. And so what would happen is, and I got this from testimony of two people, Black people who were in Europe at the time. What would happen is the white commanding officers would arouse the Black troops at, say, 2 in the morning, coincidentally, and march through white women, indigenous women, who would point out men in the line. And because of the language barrier, they often were pointing out men they had dated, and the white officers would say they were accusing them of rape and take them out, and they'd never be seen again. I'm not saying that happened in Lewis Till's case, but there has been some suspicion. We do have the transcript of his court-martial, which does open a lot of questions about whether it was a righteous conviction.
Did Mamie Till-Mobley ever speak to a therapist?
No.
Okay. People are asking about the poll. They said they lost the poll. It might just have been minimized. It's probably still there. It'll come back.
I canceled mine. I hope that didn't affect everybody's.
No, that's okay. Was his body embalmed by the Mississippi Black Funeral Home in order to help preserve it on its return to Chicago?
Not in a complete way. There was something that was applied to help preserve it. There was some testimony that he was embalmed, but that was in dispute. And in the book, we talk about Mamie's testimony that there was lime or something that was inside the casket with them to preserve it or destroy it. We're not sure which. But there was enough that was preserved, and the glass enclosed casket helped to preserve his remains over the course of nearly 50 years, so that when the FBI exhumed the body during that investigation that was cited earlier, it was pretty much intact, and they could perform an autopsy at that time that provided evidence that was useful.
A couple people have asked or mentioned the shooting that took place last night. The young man, Jacob Blake, who was shot in the back, he graduated from ETHS. Do you have anything to add?
Well, it's of a piece, isn't it, with all of these stories? I mean, we don't know what the dispute was about at that moment, but it was clear that he was not posing a threat based on the video. And it also was clear that with what looked like 4 officers on the scene, he could have been restrained without deadly force. And he's still alive, but clearly 7 shots was not meant to stop him. But yeah, it flows from the same set of considerations we're talking about, right? We put it in a power construct, and we have to consider whether this is a justifiable exercise of police power or an abuse of power. And it keeps playing out. It's so interesting too, because I saw a piece of the Republican convention, or as one commentator, it was Rachel Maddow, called it the convention-ish. Speech that was made by the couple out of St. Louis, who brandished their guns when a peaceful demonstration was walking past their homes. And I had a split screen as I heard them talking about the threat to the suburbs, the destruction of the suburbs. And I thought about Blake and the shooting in Wisconsin, and the threat that they posed to the demonstrators. And when you see that, you have a deeper appreciation of the systemic nature of this thing that we're grappling with, that it starts in communities. It flows up to through the lines of authority, the police, and in the case of the Emmett Till story, the sheriff in the county, even the elected officials. The piece about Lewis Till was part of a confidential court-martial record that was freed up by the US Senator from Mississippi at the time in order to affect public attitudes about Emmett Till because of whatever was being said about Lewis Till. So this goes all the way, and we can question in this moment whether it goes all the way to the highest levels of power in this country.
Yeah. Chris, those are all the questions we have. Do you have anything else you'd like to add before we sign off?
Just that I really am grateful for this time that we have together and the opportunity to share this story, a story that I think is vitally important for us to understand, and on all the levels we talked about, and then this one as well, that we tend to look at these stories in sort of a narrow context. Emmett Till is not just an African-American story, it's an American story. And increasingly, I'm called upon to share this with public school teachers who are struggling to find ways to engage curriculum offerings in diversity and the meaning of diversity, the meaning of